What is something shocking you found out about a friend or family member after they died? Some people are just absolute shit. My mother did this, but with pills. It always seemed like attention seeking, which she did all the time too. She would always find out when you were coming back and she would take a bunch of pills about an hour before you were supposed to get back. I found her the first time when I was 5. Walked into her laying unconscious on the living room floor. The second time and final attempt in my life, she had 4 attempts in hers. Same thing, but my stepdad came home a little later, but found her in time to get her to the emergency room. We watched her suffer for 3 weeks in the ICU before she succumbed to her attempt. It scarred me and him, but the added jab to him was it financially ruined him. I don't know for sure, but I think he was going to divorce her before she did that. Some people like my mother never account for all the goddamn damage they bring to their families, during their lives and after. My neighbor burned her family home down in an attempt. She had a whole setup to make it seem like people were bullying her, keyed bitch into her own car as an example, and then set her room on fire. That first attempt didn't work since they were able to put the fire out quickly. My dad went over to see the damage to her room because everyone was under the impression that a bully started the fire. Turns out while he was looking around, the neighbor set the basement on fire, got scared, and walked out. My dad ran out after smelling the fire and shortly after my toddler sister walked out. Nobody noticed she had followed my dad in since we were all playing in the front yard and we were friendly enough with this family to come and go. I watched the windows bow out and eventually the house burned to the ground, while my neighbor cried on the lawn. Insurance allowed them to rebuild the house, but goddamn, she nearly killed my family members and burned up everything sentimental to her family. All for what? To stick it to the world? It's an older neighborhood, so the new-looking house sticks out like a sore thumb as a reminder. Edit for a fun fact, she collected porcelain dolls that sat on shelves that lined the top of her room. Her room was burned but mostly intact after the first fire, so the image of burned dolls covered with soot is burned into my brain forever. My wife's dad passed away over 10 years ago. Growing up she had 2 half-brothers. Her mom had been married twice before she married my wife's dad. Last year during all the initial COVID lockdown she decided to finally go through all the family photos that she had gotten from her parents over the years. Her mom was moved into a memory care unit for dementia a couple of years ago. She's identifying family members and reaching out to them on Facebook, offering them copies of photos they are in if they want them. But there's one picture of her and a boy who appears to be a couple of years older that she can't identify. So she starts asking the various relatives that she's contacted. One of them tells her that he's her half-brother. A half-brother she had no idea that she had until that very moment when she instantly remembered a comment her dad had made when she was very, very young. Turns out he lives 20 minutes away from us. She found him on Facebook and reached out to him. They spent several days texting back and forth. Turns out his mother wanted nothing to do with my wife's dad after they were divorced and didn't want him around his son. Rather than fight her, my wife's dad just stopped seeing his boy. After corresponding for a couple of weeks, he and his son stopped by our house to say hello. We all get along very well. He and I text pretty often because we both have ordered Broncos that we are waiting for. My wife and him text at least weekly as well. We've been out to dinner with them and are talking about going on a trip together soon. Created a throwaway for this. When I was 16, my mother and I were living in poverty. The lease on our home was coming up and wasn't going to be renewed. The new landlords wanted to make some desperately needed repairs on the house, as it had never once passed a single inspection from the day we moved in. We had nowhere else to go. Out of the blue, my mother's uncle, my great-uncle, showed up and offered to let us come live with him. He'd been my mother's favorite uncle when she was growing up, but they'd lost touch before I was even born. It turns out, he lived only a few short hours away, and was in need of some live-in help. His health was bad, and deteriorating. My mother took care of him, driving him to doctor's appointments, helping him after surgeries, etc. For years, she did this, and in return he took care of not only her, but me, and even some friends of mine. He and my mother were the kindest, most generous souls I'd ever met, and for the longest time, I told everyone he was like the father I never had. He died right after Christmas some 14 years later, within a week of my 30th birthday, as it happened. He went into the hospital on my birthday, and less than a week later he was gone. It was one surgery too many, and he didn't have the strength to pull through. I stayed with my mother for as long as I could, trying to help her figure out what her next steps would be. He'd had a will, leaving her everything. His house, his bank accounts, all of it. But the will was gone. No one knew where it went. We searched high and low, but never found it. What I did find, however, was a marriage certificate. My mother was married to her uncle, and had been for over a decade. You see, he went into the hospital for surgery one day, and in the process, the doctors realized he'd need a second surgery. Instead of keeping him under, they had to let him come out of it and become coherent enough to consent to the second surgery. As his niece, my mother didn't have a say in that. Why not simply make her power of attorney? He had amazing health insurance and retirement. By becoming his wife, she was able to be put on his health insurance. She was getting older, they were roughly a decade apart in age, and needed health care, dental, and vision. She was also the beneficiary of his life insurance after his death, as well as his Social Security and veterans benefits, thus ensuring that she was taken care of long after he passed. I was never able to call him my stepfather in life, because I never knew. My mother was always afraid I wouldn't understand or that I'd judge. Their relationship wasn't physical. My mother is a CSA survivor and is repulsed by sex, and his health was too poor and his medications too severe for him to be able to do anything of the sort. I understand why they didn't tell me, because I hesitate to tell other people. It's not a dark secret or anything I'm ashamed of, because I knew the nature of their relationship wasn't like that. But it's definitely something that requires explanation, and it's hard to tell how someone's going to take it. Edit. Oh my God, thank you all so much for the acceptance, support, and awards. I noticed some questions in the comment thread this inspired, so I'll try to answer them as best I can. So my mother's father was career military, supposedly, and left when she was 9 years old, never to be seen again. I never met the guy and pretty much resented him. Fast forward to 2003 and my mom gets a letter in the mail about some kind of life insurance policy from a chaplain with a last name we'd never heard of before. My mom does some digging and finds out that this guy is actually her father. Except he had a totally different last name than her family's. And he's supposedly a Catholic priest and was a chaplain in the army for decades. As in the kind that's supposed to be celibate. So yet turns out my grandparents met during WW2 and afterward ended up having 4 kids together while grandpa had a whole other life on the East Coast. My grandmother died a few years before, so we were never able to get the full story, but it's kinda wild that there's just a whole other family that no one knew about. that my grandpa left all of his donated book credit in my name at our local indie bookstore. I came back from college when he passed away and visited the store to pick up some textbooks I had ordered through for the next semester. The gal who owns the store told me when I went to pay for them. I don't cry in front of people much, but when I tell you I had a full-on ugly cry meltdown in that store. I was dyslexic as a kid, and my grandpa most likely had some learning disabilities growing up as well. Dyslexia wasn't recognized at that time, but that didn't stop him from always encouraging me to read. He would read along with me as a kid, and then when I got older he read books I was assigned in school, and whatever trendy novels I was interested in at the time, so we could talk about them. We always went to the bookstore to buy them. When his health was failing he couldn't really read anymore, so he did his last donation and asked if he could pass his store credit on to me. He had a lot of books to donate. When I say a lot, I mean he read a Western a day after he retired and had been donating to the store for 20 plus years. Add on him donating all of the favorite books he had kept over the years and you basically get a discount for life. I go in whenever I visit family now, and the owner joked that I'll never truly be able to use all the credit he had saved up. My great-grandpa on my dad's side lived to be 101. He was the pinnacle of health for his entire life. Ate a very good diet with basically zero sugar, got regular exercise, and had all his mental functions and senses even in his old age. The man was still walking everywhere and taking buses on his own until literally the day he died. He passed due to medical complications after a broken hip from a fall when he tripped on some steps. After he was gone, my family went to clear out the house and get everything in order. My dad opened a drawer to find a hidden stash full of chocolate bars and wrappers. The dude was so proud of his health that he felt the need to hide a sweet treat from his own family. My grandfather had gnarly scars on both his forearms, often wearing long sleeves and getting annoyed when we as kids asked what they were from. The guy was huge, having been an agricultural laborer and railway porter, super kind and gentle, a pacifist too, used to tell us loads about how pointless war/fighting was. When we asked about his scars, he always told us he got them doing some work. We assumed a pre-war farming accident or something involving a train. He rarely talked about WW2, which was not unusual for his generation where I grew up. After he died ages ago, we spoke to a chap he had served in the army with, WW2, British infantry, and he told us the actual story behind his scars. Apparently he and 3 of his mates had been captured by the Japanese. Knowing that this was a really, really bad thing, Granddad had managed to get free and somehow grab a machete. He was very strong and about 6'3". His friends said he killed 5 Japanese soldiers, one of who had a sword/blade of some kind, getting pretty badly hurt in the process. After that, and recovery, he was assigned to guard a medical facility and didn't do any more frontline fighting. Apparently previously he had been quite good at fighting. His friend credited that with his pacifism. Apparently it was a bit visceral. His comrade used the term messy, but being British this was likely an understatement. He'd told pretty much nobody about this, even his wife. I know some of this is likely to be embellished because Granddad had just died. I think a bayonet is more likely than a sword, but I like to think of him winning a sword fight against a katana-armed enemy, using just a machete. Great story. When I was growing up, my neighbors were a quiet elderly couple, immigrants from the UK. They taught me to sail and I crewed for them for a while. After a couple of rums he sometimes told stories of WW2 where he was being hunted by German U-boats on an island in the Med. 60 years later, when things start to become declassified, his wife starts telling the truth. He worked for Bletchley Park and was literally one of the original SIGINT crew, gathering German signals from right under their noses. They knew he was there and he could have been shot as a spy if his unit had been caught. Plot twist: his wife also worked for Bletchley Park. They kept it secret for 60 years until it was declassified. Apparently every time they returned to the UK for a visit they breezed through customs. There was a code or something on their passports that gave them VIP treatment. A lot of these are truly upsetting, but I have a cool shocking story. I knew my grandfather was in the armed forces in the early 60s, but I didn't know that one time Martin Luther King visited. No fucking clue why he visited an army base in the middle of the civil rights movement, but whatever. And my grandfather was the only white guy on the Alabama base that greeted him and shook his hand, and who wasn't a general or something that had to. When I heard this story I was like, no fucking way, but there's a photograph. Grandpa shaking hands with milk. Amazing. Wish he or someone had told me that when he was still alive. I found this all out when I asked my father about the history of mental illness in our family when I was diagnosed bipolar last year. He said we had none, but my aunt said, don't you remember when mom went away? My dad and aunts didn't know what had happened exactly. My oldest aunt, let's call her Mary, she would have been 12 or so then, remembers the most and said it started when grandma had come home from work when they were making berry smoothies in a blender, and grandma was convinced that it was my toddler uncle's brains in the blender, despite him sitting there in the kitchen with them, alive and well. She started screaming at them about how evil they were and shaking him and trying to get him to wake up even though he was crying and screaming. At some point she grabbed a knife and was chasing them with it. Mary somehow got all the little ones and went to a neighbor's a ways down the road, middle of the country, until their dad came home. Mary met him at the driveway and explained what happened, and he told her to stay at the neighbor's until he came back. They were there a few days when someone from the state came and got them. My dad and the two older girls were put in foster care and the two younger ones went to some family. Almost a year went by and then, one day, they were all brought back together and given back to grandma, who they hadn't heard from the entire time, but their dad was just gone. Turns out after he put her away, he just moved away and left them all. She refused to talk about what happened and they all eventually found out through another family member. Another thing, she admitted nearly 20 years later, on her deathbed, she didn't die this time around but thought that she was, that my uncle, the toddler, was the result of an affair with her boss. As for my dad's father, when my dad was in his early 20s, he was working as a waiter a couple of towns over from where he had grown up, when his father walked in with his new family. He said he took their order, brought him their food, they paid the bill and left. He knew without a doubt it was his father. But he never acknowledged him, like he either didn't recognize him or he really just didn't want to. He thought he had called out to him at one point, but he was talking to his new son, who had the same name. My father is a JR and so was the new kid. He had just completely started over. There is speculation that many grandmother gave up a baby prior to getting married. When she was 19 she moved from Kansas to San Francisco to chase after some guy she liked and he was stationed there, something like that. Ended up working as a secretary for someone in the military. This would have been at the start of WW2. After a year or so she came back to Kansas and fell in love with her brother's best friend, married, and 5 kids. She was asked a few times by my mom if she gave up a baby. Grandma denied it. A few years after she passed, a family friend told us a story. How a woman she knew had gotten pregnant before marriage and forced to give up the child. Her story was she was sent to the West Coast and gave birth. Her backstory for going there was she worked for the military as a secretary. This woman was similar in age to my grandma. There were more details I don't recall that were so similar to my grandma's story. There is no one alive anymore who could confirm or deny any of grandma's story. It's just odd how two women had such similar stories.